Good evening. Welcome to the Spiritual But Not Religious Show. I'm your host, George Lewis. I've got a fantastic guest tonight. We're in for a real treat. Before I introduce her, though, I want to talk with you a bit about what we're doing and how it can benefit you. If you had a chance to browse around the site at all, you'll notice that we've got over 300 hours of really superb videos, lots and lots and lots of good documentaries, spiritual. Also, there's some science and spirituality meet documentaries. We are really intent on becoming your go-to place for all things spiritual. So you'll be able to come here, put in your question, find exactly what you're after. So be sure and come back. My guest tonight is Linda Starwolf. Linda wrote a book called Visionary Shamanism, Activating the Imaginal Cells of the Human Energy Field. And it's a pretty powerful book. I've enjoyed it. It's a good read. I'm going to bring Linda. Have we got Linda on, Tom?
Yep.
Hi, Linda. Are you able to hear me? Linda. Okay. Will the real Linda please stand up? We don't have Linda.
Is that you, George?
Hi there.
Hi.
Are you able to hear me, Linda?
Not very well.
Tom, maybe you can give her a little more.
Of you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about that, Linda. We have made some really, you know what, we've got way too much static in the background now.
Pull on the back?
Yeah, you might want to, are you able to hear me now, Linda?
I can hear you, George, but to be honest with you, if I listen very closely, I can hear you, but you sound like you're in a tunnel.
Okay, unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you to listen real closely for tonight.
I will do my best.
Okay, I really appreciate that. I want you to know I've enjoyed your book. It's a good read, well written.
Thank you.
And yeah, and you touch on some very interesting topics. But before we talk about your book, I want to talk about you and get some background on you so that our viewers will be able to relate to really what you said. I highly recommend they pick up a copy of your book. Before we get started, where can they find that at?
Well, a number of places, of course. One of the easiest places is just to go to Amazon and order it on Amazon. All my books are on Amazon except for one that I self-published years ago. And but they can also order directly from my company, Venus Rising Association for Transformation, and the website for that is Shamanic Breathwork.org, and you can go on there and order my books directly from us or Amazon. And there's a number of Barnes & Noble, there's a number of places that they can order the books from.
Great. And you also do, you work one-on-one with people, or?
I do some. I do a limited amount. You know, I have this year makes 40 years since I started working with people. So I've worked with people, individuals and groups, but for the last 15 years, I've really basically focused on workshops and teaching.
Right.
And I have a few clients that are long-standing, that I've been a spiritual guide to for years, but sometimes, a new person works their way into my life, and the best way to be with me is actually to either attend the webinars or talks like tonight, or to attend our workshops. We have workshops throughout the year. We have 2 workshops coming up actually in August, one starting this coming Sunday, and then the following Sunday after that, back-to-back here in the mountains of western North Carolina at our own retreat center called Cove.
You're up there by Asheville, aren't you?
Yes, we're about an hour west of Asheville.
Uh-huh.
And it's beautiful here. We live right in the mountains, and it's really sacred and holy land here.
And the weather is wonderful this time of year.
The weather is wonderful. We've only had air conditioning on 2 or 3 times this year so far. It's in the 80s during the day and the 60s at night.
Sounds great. That's perfect weather. Perfect.
Perfect.
Weather. So is that where you were raised, or where were you initially brought up?
Well, I grew up in rural western Kentucky, about an hour and a half from Nashville. And I grew up there, and I went to the University of Kentucky. And then that was during the 60s and 70s, so that was very interesting time to be a teenager. And I did some traveling, and I ended up living in California for a number of years in the Bay Area there in West Marin, and moved to North Carolina about 9 years ago to open our own retreat center here in the mountains and to create a community. We have a community here called the Cove community, and so we have a community and a retreat center of people that live in this area.
Okay, so they live on your property or just in the proximity?
Well, it was all our property, and then we subdivided it, and basically we sold it to our kindred spirits.
Well, that's great.
We have people here from lots of different walks of life, and around, one couple that's here we met in Egypt, although they're from the United States. They were from Springfield, Illinois, but we met them in Egypt. We have friends that we've known for a long time. We have newer friends that we've met. We had a woman that just moved here from New York City who's been a student and now is working with us. So we sold properties here, and people created their own homes, built their homes, had them built. We have people living here in structures like, we have one woman who built her own house, what's called straw bale house, and then we have other people who have had their homes professionally built in more traditional ways, and
well, great.
So everybody has their own place, and then we have community property, and then my husband and I, Brad Collins and I, own and run the retreat center, which is several acres of land.
Well, we'll have to get people coming to your website. They can find all about that. Sounds like a very interesting community that you've built there.
It is an interesting community. Everybody, almost everyone that moved here is a healer or a teacher or a counselor or a therapist. We have acupuncturists, astrologers, breathwork facilitators, massage therapists, craniosacral, marriage and family counselor, chiropractor. So everybody, minister. We have a lot of people here who are really interested in helping to make the world a better place, and who are really spiritual activists in their own ways.
Sounds great. Well, let's talk a bit about what got you into this this kind of thinking and this kind of living, and really what motivated you to finally write this book, or begin writing books, actually. You had quite an experience when you were about 12 or something, did you not?
Yes, I did. And, in some ways it's kind of hard to say where it all begins. It's kind of like, well, did it begin when I was born or before I was born, or at, different events in our lives. But, in my book on visionary shamanism, which is actually my 6th book, I talk in that book more than any of the others about my own personal experience, because people wanted to know. I found more and more that people wanted to know about me and where I came from. It's like, by whose authority do you say these things? And so I talked a little bit about some of the events that happened in my life that led up to the different processes that I've developed, and my work in the world today, and my message, if you will. And part of my message is that in order to change the world, we really have to heal ourselves.
Wait just 1 second. Before you go there, tell us about your experience when you were 12. I think that has great bearing on what you've developed from that point forward.
Sure. Well, that was a very important transformational time, and I call it a shamanic event, and shamanic events happen to all of us all the time. But that's a time when I lost a person that I really was the closest to through death, and that was my grandmother. And what had happened, my grandmother and I was an only child, and growing up in rural western Kentucky, and my parents both worked, and so I stayed on the farm with my grandparents a lot. And my grandmother, a common term for grandmother in Kentucky was Mammy. So my Mammy Jones, who I was very close with, and my grandfather, Pappy Jones, I stayed with them a lot, and the two of us were, I guess you could say, in cahoots with one another. We were very much of the same spirit, and we spent a lot of time in nature, and we spent a lot of time really talking about spiritual things. And even she was a Baptist, but I call her a renegade Baptist, meaning that she talked to the fairies. She talked with me about, ETs. She talked about all kinds of things. She taught me to relate to nature and the spirit of nature and all those kind of things, not necessarily learned in more traditional religions.
How do you suppose she was able to reconcile, Baptist with all that you just expressed?
Well, I'm not sure. All I can say that my grandmother was quite the matriarch of the family. She had quite a sense of humor. She was Dutch-Irish, and a lot of the Dutch-Irish and the people that immigrated to this country still believe in the fairies and the fairy realm, and they don't seem to have any problem, believing in fairies and magic on one hand, and the wee little people, and on the other hand, believing in, Jesus or.
That's interesting. That.
There's a lot more of that in the country than you realize. I mean, and I'll come back to talking about that. But even here in North Carolina, western North Carolina, I've come across quite a few of the mountain people that live here who are, Baptist and not just to speak of the Baptists, but other more traditional Christian religions who have no problem reconciling the differences between that and bringing it together around the world of magic.
So what I'm hearing is they may be what's called nature mystics.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, we're right next door to the Cherokee, right here next door to the Cherokee community. And so there's a strong Cherokee influence, and many of the traditional, Cherokee believe that they actually came here and were brought here by the Pleiadians.
Right.
About many years ago.
And you find that the people who live in that area are aware of the Pleiadians, and they understand this and believe that?
Some people, yeah.
Wow, that's interesting.
I travel all over the country and around the world, and in the places you wouldn't necessarily think that people believe in those sort of things, they do.
Well, let me ask you this: when you find that in those rural areas, are they openly talking about it, or are they repressed because of the community?
Well, it just depends. I mean, some people will kind of be hush-hush. Some people will just openly talk about it and very matter of fact. For instance, right here, just 30 minutes from where I live, 45 minutes in a place called Cashiers, has been some of the most recent and prolific sightings of spaceships around the country in the past 3 or 4 years. And there's a website that's been started. I think it's called Sky Ships Over Cashiers. And the local lady who runs the health food store here, is one of the main people that helped start that and contributes to it. And, she seems about as mainstream as you can be. So, and yet she's very outspoken about this. And many people in the area, go up to watch for the sky ships regularly in Cashiers. So.
Well, Cashiers Cashiers really is kind of a different town from all the others except for maybe Blowing Rock. Blowing Rock and Cashiers are kind of similar. They're really almost like Sarasota in the mountains.
Yes.
Which
That's
is
true.
Yeah, which is very, very neat. I like both of those places, and one day plan to have a home in one or the other of those two towns. Gorgeous places.
And there's just as far as my grandmother, I think that she was very open-minded, and she was very tuned in spiritually, and I think that was in part because she was very gifted. She was obviously very psychic. She always knew what was going on with me. When I was a child, we didn't have, this is, almost 60 years ago in western rural Kentucky, we didn't have telephone. We didn't have, when I was really small, we didn't even have indoor plumbing.
Right.
So she would send messages to me psychically, and I could feel that. And we didn't live too far away, just a couple of miles away. So I was there all the time, and so we had a close bond. And she recognized that I was a sensitive child and that I had special gifts, and she really cultivated those. Whereas my mom and dad were just hardworking folks, and they weren't really that interested in that world. And in fact, I think in some ways I kind of wanted to downplay it a little bit, and sometimes would say that I had an overactive imagination. So they were great folks, but they were busy, and my grandmother had the time to really cultivate that. And
right.
so she was really my rock, because I was the only child, and I would go to school, and sometimes other kids would, make fun of me, and I felt a little awkward and weird, and it was difficult for me, feeling so different at times. And I would make the mistake sometime of answering somebody's question before they asked it, things like that. And so my grandmother and I would practice talking to one another, without speaking, and
right.
answering each other and things like that. So that
she
was
really
kind of
helped.
She died when I was 12.
She really kind of helped set you on your path then.
Very much so. So you could say in some ways that I was born with these abilities, and my grandmother was, we were kindred spirits, and then she helped cultivate and support and really protect, if you will. I really need to say that. She really helped protect that. And, you hear nowadays about indigo children and crystal children, and I really think that, at that time that's what I would have been categorized as. So she really protected me, and yet it was, it wasn't easy for me.
Well, I know that when, I was in my 20s before I really started to come across any of these kinds of concepts and really got involved with them. And
right.
Even then, I had to work at protecting my psyche, because you couldn't,
yes.
People, you talk with them about it and you were of the devil.
That's very true, and that later on happened to me, which I did write about in my book, that there was a time when in the town that I lived in, later on, actually I was in my 30s, when I had a private counseling practice, and I was working a lot with abused women, and really helping them get free from life-threatening situations. And because some of those women left destructive relationships and marriages and got divorces, and people knew that they were seeing me, and there was kind of a run on that happened for a while, because I got a reputation of being someone who could help women who were being physically and emotionally abused. And they would come to me and feel safe, and then I would be able to help them to find the courage to do what they need to do to protect themselves and their children. And so for a little while, there was some rumors that I was an agent of the devil.
I'll bet you had two different, kinds of viewpoints. From one side, you're helpful, and the other side, you're messing things up.
Very true. It's, I said I never felt so loved and hated as I did during that time. And it was
definitely polarized.
It was definitely polarized. I mean, there were people who thought, who frequently said that they didn't think they would be alive, or that they would be safe, or their children would be safe, and all those kind of things. And there was a lot of abuse in the area that I was living in. And I was aware of that, and I really took on the cause of working with, especially during that time, with abused women and children. So that was it was an interesting time. I learned a lot, and to this day, I'm grateful I was able to work with those women, and I can really say it made a difference in that community. And it really, it's kind of like once somebody does something in the community, it really filters out to everyone else, and that there's a lot of things that have changed there since then.
Well, there's another thing I think happens too for us on an individual basis. A lot of this kind of thing, when you get into the shamanism and you get into the mystic realm and you get into all of these kind of things, it's pretty easy to lose your grounding.
Yes.
And like by having had that experience with abused women and doing that kind of work, I suspect that it helped you to stay grounded while you're doing these other shamanic kinds of journeys.
Absolutely. My grandmother was really great at grounding me, and that was one of the things that happened when she died, is I lost my grounding cord. And that cord was really lost for about 17 years, because I went through a whole process of being lost, and especially in the late 60s and 70s, it was a wonderful time. It was an amazing time. I learned so much, but I also got lost in the process, and I went into addiction.
I was just going to ask you if that manifested in addiction, because that happens so often with us.
Absolutely, because the addiction was the way to deal with that feeling of abandonment and loss and hurt and pain, and it was also a time of great exploration for a lot of people and their teens. A lot of drugs were coming on the scene, psychedelics and different things, and so that was an opportunity to explore, and it seemed like, everybody was doing that. And then for someone like me who was feeling so lost anyway, it really became a crutch for me. And between some of the drugs and the alcohol during that period of time, I really got lost for a period of time. And when I came back out, in my late 20s, when I finally came back out of that place, and I got sober when I was 29, so it was almost 31 years ago. When I got sober, my life really came back on track, but something else happened. All my psychic abilities, all my sensitivities were still there that I had really kind of pushed down.
Right.
So I was left being very vulnerable and very sensitive again, and I really had to start finding ways to do just what you said, to ground myself. So I began to ground myself through meditation, through yoga, and it may not sound grounding, but it was grounding for me. I studied the Ascended Masters. I was listening to guided imagery tapes at that time. It was when they were still tapes. And I was reading things like the autobiography of a yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda, and those things actually helped to ground me. Edgar Casey, who actually lived and died about 30 minutes from where I lived and grew up in western Kentucky. Reading about other people's lives who were mystics and who were naturally gifted in that area and drawn to the spiritual helped me feel more normal. And a lot of that information was coming out in the 70s, and so I didn't feel so weird because I didn't really, at the time, know human beings that were alive were around me who were like that. And, I could relate to the addiction part with other people who had addictions, but I was having trouble finding people who were having the kind of experiences I was having.
Well, I really understand the grounding part about reading these things because I was a mystic long before I realized I was a mystic. And the phenomenon that goes with that is kind of unsettling at times. And
it is.
If you talk with the wrong people, you get some feedback that's pretty negative.
Right. Well, I worked in the mental health system, and I had people all around me that I was working with that were having mental breakdowns, and
Right.
And I would work, of course, with other therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists. I was a case manager, and so I did a lot of things like that. And sometimes, I was very aware that I would be talking to the patients, and I was identifying more with them than I was the mental health professionals.
Right.
And, and I'd have to really listen and say, okay, this person's hearing something and seeing something. Are they really, truly schizophrenic, or are they just super sensitive? And what is schizophrenia anyway?
Right. It's just kind of
I for the first few years of my mental health career, I really specialized in working with people who were diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar illness. And, I was really good at working with people like that. I really understood them, and I think that, I was about a breath away from a diagnosis myself, to be honest with you.
Well, I think, the difference is that veil kind of gets torn or pulled away, and all of a sudden these folks are exposed to sensory perceptions that, the rest of us are really protected from. Yes,
that's really true. That sheath is there, that, that veil, if you will, that kind of shields us between the worlds, because, I think most of us know at some level now that we're multidimensional beings. If nothing else, most people will accept that we're physical, emotional, and mental beings,
yes.
And then others accept that we're spiritual beings. But even beyond that, what we might be, those are those realms, but even beyond that we're multidimensional, like Barbara Hand Clow's work when she talks about multidimensionality. And so if we accept that we're multidimensional beings and that, if you will, there's doorways and gateways between those dimensions, depending on where we focus our consciousness or develop our abilities or open our psyches, it can be very threatening to the ego mind.
Absolutely. Well, that brings me to just the next thing I'd like to talk about with you, and that's your journey, actually walking between worlds. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I've had a lot of experience of walking through it consciously and unconsciously. As I said, I feel like that I was walking through it consciously as a child, and then walked through it rather unconsciously as an adolescent. I like I said, I was involved in altered states in ways that perhaps created confusion and certainly created some risk for me on many levels. And but those were learning experiences too. You know, I'm grateful that I made it through, and I understand you know, people's desire to experiment with things that will take them into altered states. And that really led to, in my sobriety, if you will, and to my own exploration out into the world, especially in my early 30s and mid-30s, to finding other ways to alter my state of consciousness that wouldn't blow me out, that wouldn't hurt me physically, that wouldn't leave me messed up, that wasn't illegal, all those kinds of things, and that would help me open up to those dimensions in a safe way, in a way that I guess you could say that would challenge my ego. You know, we need to challenge old thought forms and structures and sometimes go through some ego death. I call it shamanic death and rebirth.
Right.
But at the same time, not be so abrupt or intense to the ego structure that you end up on the back wards of the mental hospital. And so that's when I really began to develop my work with breathwork and with shamanism as it's developed today over the past, 20 plus years.
Well, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson, was actually a mystic.
Absolutely.
He was involved with Gerald Hurd, and they have a little magazine called The Grapevine. Back in the 40s, he was recommending...
Oh, I remember all that, yeah.
He was recommending mystic writings for about 4 months. I think they probably shut him off on that, but...
That's true. He was very involved in the mystical world.
Absolutely.
And
as a matter of fact...
That really, that's one of the things that really, really appealed to me about recovery.
Yes.
And about the concept that you could believe in a higher power of your own choosing. And that was already where I was in my consciousness. But I finally was able, my Christian roots didn't really give me permission for that.
Absolutely.
But the recovery programs did. And so that was really where I got permission to be myself, was in recovery, quite frankly.
Probably broke down a lot of those old belief structures you were talking about also.
Yeah. It's like in some ways they were already broke down. If you'd have asked me in my teens and my 20s, I'd have said, oh, yeah, I don't believe in all that stuff.
Right.
That was just the religion of my childhood. But the truth is in my subconscious, they were still there, those thought things. And so when I started, when I was in recovery and as I started to meditate and do breath work, all those old belief systems, they came to meet me and said, hello, and I got to work through those consciously.
I got involved with meditation in 1974, I guess, with TM. Was my first foray into meditation. I've been meditating ever since.
Yeah, meditation is a part of my practice each day, as well as breath work.
Well, one thing I find about meditation, if it doesn't do anything else for people, it certainly has a way of offering us clarity, which in and of itself is grounding.
Yes.
Now, yes, you can take meditation and you can meditate as a yogi or a Buddhist, and you can spend so much time in the etheric worlds, you forget that you're also human. And
that's so important, George. That's a big, big part of our work. Venus Rising, our Association for Transformation, our work is really about becoming a real human being. And part of my walking between worlds is I made a connection in my early 40s with a grandmother from the Seneca Nation named Grandmother Twyla Nitch, who was the Wolf Clan grandmother. She passed in 2007 at 94. But Grandmother Twyla always talked about, when she was teaching very mystical teachings and talking about the star beings and the star people, she always talked about growing corn with what you believed. And she would say, if it doesn't grow corn, then it's not worth anything.
Exactly.
And she would say, she would say, now what you're talking about, does that grow corn? And she would also talk about becoming a real human being. And she'd say, people are just walking around and they think they're human beings, but they're really only half. They're not whole. Because if human beings were wholly human, they would be very humane.
Absolutely.
And they would be kind to one another, and they would love and see that everything, all things, not just the two-legged, but the four-legged and the flying ones and the creatures that swim and the standing trees or the standing people, she called them, and the mountains, that everything is, they're all part of our relations. Oma Takwiyase, she would say. They're all part of our relations. They're our brothers and sisters. And so to walk between the worlds of plant, mineral, animal, human, and spirit is truly the gift of learning how to be shamanic.
Well, you know, that whole concept that, you know, like humanity has separated itself from nature has caused a huge rift, a big schism in our psyches, and we're not apart from nature.
Yes.
And until we come back with that idea, we have real problems. So how did you actually become a visionary shaman? And tell us what you mean by a visionary shaman.
Well, you know, I had visions my whole life, and I've always been, it wasn't until I met Grandma Twyla, as I said, in my 40s that I actually got a name for some of what I experienced, because my grandmother left at 12, died unexpectedly, so it was a huge gap in there. And when I met Grandma Twyla, it was like she kind of took up the place where my grandmother had left off in my training.
Uh-huh.
And she talked to me frequently about being a visionary and told me that I was a visionary. And when I told her about my dreams and how I could see things and they would come true, she told me that I was a dream walker and that she was a dream walker too. And in fact, that's how I first met her, was in dream vision. So she comes into people's dreams, and that frequently happens to me. I can't tell you how many people will contact me through Facebook or email or in some way, or come up to me even at a book signing and say, I met you in a dream before I even knew who you were. So there's a thin world out there, you know, a veil between the worlds, and I'm obviously one who walks into other people's dreams and do work with people that way. And I think that what that really means is that I'm very open, and so my energy is there and available to connect with other people's energies at different times. And I'm not sure exactly how that happens, but I know it happens unconsciously and consciously. The other thing is that I've had so many visions come true in my life that I've shared with people over the years, starting with my grandmother when I was very young. And there was a period of time when I stopped sharing it because I was afraid of people in the area that I was from at that time, you know, saying that I was working with the devil or something, because they were afraid of those kinds of things. And I had some teenage girls who got afraid of me, you know, those kinds of things.
Right.
But as I got older, I really began to, and especially after I, you know, got sober, I really began to work with those gifts through different teachers and to develop them. And one of the things that I really, as I opened up to the, you know, to my true gifts, if you will, I began to really see these as gifts from my Creator, from my higher power, and not to be afraid of them, not to push them down. And over time, as I shared those with more people, and more people saw that I, you know, was a visionary and more of a mystic, they would ask me if I could help them to have visions and help them to become more mystical. And that's really where my work took off, is sharing my own experience around that and developing processes like the Shamanic Breathwork process to help people access their own inner visionary, their own inner shaman. Well, and over the past 25 years, I've probably taken thousands of people through the breathwork process and opened them to their visionary shaman.
You know, the thing that I hear very clearly here is that, and this in my own life has certainly been hugely important, is that without that door of willingness, that openness, we can't really find our way to these other areas. We get knowing too much, and we get closed down, and the doors are shut on us. So we have to find our way to an openness in what we think we know. Isn't that kind of what you say happened for you?
Yeah, you know, my journey really is, I think, in some ways, a classic hero or heroine's journey.
Right.
You know, I think I you know, was very awake as a child. I think that probably more people are awake than what they remember as they grow older. And I think the abrupt of the person who really got who I was, of her death, shocked me, and it was like a post-traumatic response, and shocked me, and there was soul loss. And that then took me in the underworld.
Right.
And I went on, that hero's journey. I set out into a journey in unknown territories and waters, and underwent several initiations, and got lost, for a while in the abyss. And then when I returned, there was a gradual reawakening, and then it sped up very quickly. And when that happened, and I was able to bring more maturity to those gifts and begin to develop, from my own experience, some wisdom, there was if you will, a passion that ignited to share that with other people. And I think that when that passion ignites to share it with other people, that the people and places appear, synchronicities happen. And it's just like the teacher appears when the student is ready, but also the students appear when the teacher is ready.
Absolutely.
And that's really, I would say really, especially since my mid-30s to now, that's really been my path. Because I started out in the mental health field when I was in my 20s, and by the time I was 40, I'd left the mental health and addictions field as just doing that, and had really moved into being what I call a shamanic teacher and shamanic breathwork facilitator. And then 16 years ago, I started Venus Rising, my own organization, and the motto for that was really about healing ourselves and healing the world.
Uh-huh.
And, breathing, doing breath work and other things like that to take us into natural altered states so that we could learn how to walk between these worlds and bring that wisdom back into our everyday lives. And I talk a lot about embodying shamanic consciousness in everyday living.
Well, let's talk a bit about something that I think our viewers will find even more interesting. By the way, our conversation here has been really interesting. I appreciate you as a guest. You're a great guest.
Thank you, George.
Let's talk about activating our imaginal cells. Tell us what an imaginal cell is.
I got really excited just a couple of years ago, I think it was, when I heard Barbara Marx Hubbard talk about imaginal cells, and then shortly after that, Deepak Chopra. And as I began to research what they were talking about, because at first it was, I almost could understand it, but I wasn't quite sure that they were saying what I thought they were saying. And after I did some research and learned that was a term that actually scientists had coined that phrase of imaginal cells to describe what happens in the journey, for instance, of a caterpillar to a butterfly and other creatures that transform in that way, that what I mean by that way, that really drop their old form and transform into a completely new creature. And I don't know how you can get much more graphic than a little creature, that's a caterpillar that crawls around on maybe one bush perhaps its whole life, as a caterpillar, and then at some point it stops kind of walking around in circles and just kind of being in consumer mode, if you will, and eating all the time.
Right.
And it stops, and it seems to know all of a sudden that there's something that needs to happen. And as it spins itself into its chrysalis form, and it creates that from its own body, basically what it's preparing to do is undergo what I would call a shamanic initiation, to undergo a death and a rebirth. So it's not a total death to the creature, but it is a real death of an old form. And the form barely resembles the form that it's going to take. I mean, you might just say, well, you can see certain aspects of it, after it's reborn. But really, how different could it be? The creature that now is born, instead of just kind of taking and eating, all the leaves on the tree or the bush, becomes a pollinator. And it gives back. And it constantly is moving from place to place. And even though it's, getting its sustenance, it's also bringing a great, beautiful process to the plants that it connects with. and instead of only crawling, this creature could only crawl a small distance, can now fly thousands of miles, and vacation in South America.
Absolutely. Well, isn't that this really on another level the same process that happens to people who really get involved in recovery?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the same thing. You can see someone completely down on their luck. I mean, everybody's lost faith in them. They've lost everything. They've lost their self-respect. They're bankrupt physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and this can be an addiction with substances, but it can also be with addiction to depression, addiction to a dysfunctional relationship and codependent. It can be on so many levels.
You can be addicted to dread.
You could be addicted to dread. You could be addicted to food.
Yeah, it's an amazing
TV,
thing.
to sex, to anything.
Right.
But when you hit bottom with it, usually you're pretty bankrupt, and you're not much in a mode where you're able to give a whole lot of, to others, except maybe in a codependent way. And so to move from caterpillar to butterfly is an amazing symbol, really. But it's a living symbol. It's real. And what they talk about is the imaginal cells that exist in the imagination of the caterpillar. And I love that because when you're a human being and you hit a bottom and you feel like there's no place to go, you have to be able to reach out to something greater than yourself. You have to reach out to your creativity, to your imagination, to something that can imagine that there is hope, that can imagine that there is a way out. When it just seems like, sometimes when I'm working with people and they tell me their dilemma, if I bought into it, I just say, I'm sorry, that's it. You can't get out of this. And it seems like everywhere you turn, there's no way out. But this little caterpillar, wrapped up in this chrysalis where there's no way out, finds a way to dissolve who it was and to imagine itself into something else and to activate the cells that are in its energetic field as it's dissolving. And as it activates those energetic cells, somehow, through the secretions in its body, through the enzymes, these cells, it's like if you will, it's kind of like an alarm clock that, finally goes off. It's the time, the alarm. There's an awakening. And those cells work steadily to create out of this, what I call caterpillar mush, to create this brand new creature that I just spoke about. And so this is really what has become a passion of mine, knowing that this is the exact process that happened for me and my transformation, and that I witness all the time with people.
Absolutely.
I just didn't have the words imaginal self. So now when I talk to people, instead of simply talking to them about changing or going through cycles of change, or even bringing in the powerful symbol of being shamanic, of going through death and rebirth, I talk to them about activating their imaginal selves that they don't even know exist right now. And that until they're really, like you said a minute ago, really ready and willing to be open to new possibilities and to fully let go of their old lives, that those imaginal cells can't activate.
Well, I think there's another quality that has to be there too, and that is the really magical power of intent. I think intent plays a big role in the imaginal part of that. What do you think?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that last thing that you said.
Well, I'm convinced that intent is a magical quality. It plays a huge role in the imaginal selves.
Yeah.
There was there's a Christian scriptural phrase that talks about, I think from Genesis, that we were made in the image of God. And I'm quite convinced that what was really being said is we were made in the imagination of God.
I love that. I really do love that,
So tell us about the shamanic portal to Wonderland. When I first got in recovery, I was ready to be rocketed into the fourth dimension, anywhere but where I was at. If you'd have talked to me about the shamanic portal to Wonderland, I'd have been on your train.
Well, there are many shamanic portals that open up in our lives And we have to have the willingness and the honesty, if you will, self-honesty, to be able to truly touch into the world of magic. And some people are afraid to hear the word magic.
Right.
They equate it with other things. But the world of magic and miracles and wonder and imagination, all of those things, they're, our God-given birthright. It's who we are. The fact that we're even alive and on this planet and have the consciousness that we do and can be self-reflective are some of the greatest miracles that we can imagine and we take for granted. We're kind of like the fish that swim around in the ocean going, where's the water, where's the water? And
Absolutely.
We live in magic every single day. And, living here in North Carolina in the mountains and seeing the mist rise over these blue mountains and the pink-tinged clouds as the sun sets over the mountains and all of the creatures that are here, there's so many. This is a rainforest, and it just started raining. It's like there's so many creatures that live here that are mystical. My husband planted over 100 butterfly bushes on our property, so we have hundreds of butterflies flying around on this property. So I get to watch the process all the time of these imaginal cells at work with the butterflies. But I also get to watch the imaginal cells all the time and hundreds of people who've come to our retreat center and also that we work with around the country and the world and retreats as they enter into through these shamanic portals. And I'm going to give you just one little example of something that just happened yesterday of a shamanic portal that happens in my life every day. And as I was with two women who are friends of mine, one named Nita and another friend named Sherry Starfire, and we were out and about because we're building a particular medicine wheel dedicated to the bees and to all of the little creatures of the earth. And we went to a beautiful rock and gem store down the street here that some friends of mine own. And before we left, we thought we would say a prayer and actually pull some cards from my book, The Anubis Oracle Deck. And it's a book and deck of cards that I co-created with co-author Nikki Scully, who's also a shamanic teacher. And so we pulled some cards, and I pulled a card, and I pulled an eagle card. And the two of them both pulled the Sphinx. So we had the eagle, and we had two Sphinxes. And we said, so this is the energy that's going with us today to create this beautiful wheel where people can come and sit and pray and meditate in our little peace park that we have here at Isis Cove. So we went down to the rock and gem store, and when we got out, they had some concrete statuary outside. And the first thing we noticed is that they had two Sphinxes and an eagle. And, you might think, well, okay, that's, so what? Lots of places. Well, they don't have very many concrete things there. It's not like they have a huge, massive. And they only had two Sphinxes, not three, but two, and only one eagle. And they were the first thing we'd seen after pulling the two Sphinxes and the eagle. And it was just that kind of, so of course we bought them to put into the Peace Park.
Absolutely.
But on the way home, the three of us were talking about how that kind of magic, that kind of wonder happens in our lives all the time because we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear and to not invalidate that God is speaking to us and winking at us and saying, here's a little shamanic portal. How do you like these two Sphinxes and the eagle, winking at us.
Absolutely, and you had the openness to be able to do that. You know what, Star? I've had such a great time with you. The only problem is that the time has just flown by, and we're really out of time at this point. But I'll tell you what, I'd like to give you a couple of minutes here. If there's something that we didn't talk about that you think is truly important, this is your time to tell us about that. If not, give us your website again, and we'll say goodbye.
Well, I would like to say just in closing, and then I'll give you my website. I would like to say that we all have a visionary within. We all have a wisdom keeper within, and I like to say we have a shaman within us, one that can direct us if we are willing to take the time, if we're willing to use our intent, if we're also willing to surrender to that bigger power, a bigger energy than our everyday ordinary self. And I encourage people to find what works for them we use a process called Shamanic Breathwork that's been beneficial to thousands of people. And I encourage people to use whatever methods, whatever spiritual techniques they can to become real human beings and to enjoy their lives and to bring more joy and happiness into their own lives and others, and to bring their special gifts to the world in a time that greatly, greatly needs that. And if people would like to know more about where I'm going to be, I travel a lot, but I'm here a lot too. If you'd like to know about our upcoming trainings and transformation programs, if you'd like to travel with us to Peru to do breathwork and journey in December, any of those things, please go to shamanicbreathwork.org, and you can also go to Linda Starwolf Facebook, or you can email me at starwolf@shamanicbreathwork.org, and myself or one of my staff will be happy to get back with you, and we look forward to meeting or hearing from many of you.
Fantastic.
And thank you, George, for having me on.
Thank you. And the next time I'm in North Carolina, that's one of my favorite spots to go. I'm going to look you up there. You get down here to Sarasota, be sure and contact me.
I'll be in Fort Walton area. Of course, that's not in Sarasota. I will be in Florida in February of next year before I head out west to do a West Coast tour with a new book called The Sacred Medicine of the N-Star Medicine Wheel.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm sure that we will meet up somewhere on the trail here, so I'll look forward to that.
Well, please come and see us. We'd love to show you around Isis Cove and take you to some of the sacred sites here on our land and our retreat center.
Oh, you can count. I will be there at some point. So, listen, you have a good night. Thank you for taking the time to be on the show with us. We really enjoyed you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
And good night now.
Bye-bye.
Well, that was a pleasant and enlightening trip through shamanism with Linda Starwolf. I really recommend you pick up on her book, Visionary Shamanism. You know, one of the things that I think is really important is the fact that, you know, in her work she brings you back into our humanness, because, you know, that etheric part of us, that part of us that can get way out there, needs to do that, but we also need to stay here in these bodies and get grounded and really integrate that part of ourselves as we mature in our spiritual journey. I've got a great guest lined up for next week, and be sure and come back. Spend some time here on the website, watch some of the great films that we have, and do recommend us to a friend. Come back next week, and in the meantime, don't forget to accentuate the positive and have a fantastic week.